Welcome to Thursdays with Torah, or Torah with Thursdays, or Thursday Torah, or the Thursday morning Torah class. All of these are acceptable alternatives. This morning, we are talking about Parshat Yitro, and Parshat Yitro is the section of the Torah which contains the Ten Commandments. And I want to divide up our class this morning into a couple of parts because I want to talk first of all about the Ten Commandments in general, and then about two of them in particular, the most obvious and the least obvious in a way. So first of all, the Ten Commandments in general, it is interesting that the Parshat itself is named after a non-Jew, after Yitro, as opposed to being after a Jew or a neutral name. And so that is, I think, in some ways a tribute to the, I was going to say the Catholic nature, small c, obviously, or the ecumenical nature of the Torah's reach, in that anyone who wishes to can come to Torah, as Yitro did, and the rabbis assume that Yitro converted to Judaism and therefore became Moshe's father-in-law as a Jewish example, as well as the original priesthood of Midian, which was his. And the Ten Commandments, which are in some ways the foundation, the rock on which the Torah stands, and in other ways are considered no more important than other sections of the Torah. It depends in what context and who you ask, have obviously in Western civilization become enormously important and central in some ways to Western civilization, such that, there are debates about whether you should put them in public and whether they're religious or not religious, although clearly they have a religious implication in that they begin with, I am the Lord your God. And there are, and therefore one assumes that they are the most fundamental moral statements that the Torah has to offer us. And interestingly, they are mostly negative statements, not entirely, right? One is you should honor your father and mother, but there's lo tirtzach, lo tin'af, lo tignov, lo ta'aneh b'reacha et shaker, lo tachmod. The last five all start with lo, you shall not, right? You shouldn't kill, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't commit adultery, you shouldn't covet, you shouldn't bear false witness, all those things. And it gives you, first of all, an understanding and a sense that in fact, the boundaries of civilization are largely negative. You should not do that. Within the no's, there are many yeses, right? But there are certain things that you cannot do and still have a stable, civilized, and holy society. And so the beginning of the Ten Commandments is the statement, sort of the statement of authority of why this matters, which is, I'm the Lord your God. In one instance, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that is, I should have started the other way. I'm the Lord your God, who is creator of the universe. That is, I have established this world and I'm now going to tell you the moral rules for this world. And also, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. That is, I have a special relationship, Israel, with you. So it isn't just that I am the creator and fashioner of the world and therefore able to give you its foundational both religious and sort of civic rules, but also I'm giving rules specially to Israel, like Shabbat, right? That you should remember the Shabbat is not a universal rule that God gives to the entire world. It's a rule for Israel. Shabbat observance is not expected of the non-Jew in the Torah. It's expected of the Israelite. And that that I have this special relationship with you and you have special rules that set you apart, that's also interwoven into the Ten Commandments. And now, I want to take two of them, and it will become clear why I choose these two as I do. One is actually covered in my Jerusalem Post Torah column, which I refer you to again, but I'm going to go over part of that. And then the first one, this one, is separate. Why do we need the Ten Commandments to know not to murder? Lo tirtzach, don't kill. It's not don't kill, but don't murder. And I do want to make that distinction because it's clear, since the Torah, among other things, calls for capital punishment, that killing itself is not the issue. The issue is unjust killing. You shall not murder. So why is it that the Ten Commandments assumes that people need this? And I really became aware of this as an issue in what I think was my first debate with Christopher Hitchens, one of those religion atheist debates, where he got up and he said, basically, this is how foolish the Torah is. It thinks that if God doesn't say don't murder, you won't know not to murder. But of course, as I pointed out at the time, that's not what the Torah says or assumes at all. In fact, the Torah does assume that you know not to murder without the Ten Commandments. And we know this because the first murder committed in the Torah was when Cain killed Abel. And it's long before the Ten Commandments, and God condemns Cain for that. So the Torah does assume that you would naturally know that you should not murder. The question then becomes, why is it in there? What makes the Ten Commandments central to Judaism and then to Western civilization is that it begins with, I am the Lord your God. And therefore, everything that follows, all the rules that follow, are not actually socially created rules. And they're not relativistic. They are absolute principles from the God who created the world. They are woven into the fabric of the universe. It is wrong to murder. It's not right in one society and wrong in another society. It is wrong. And this is so incredibly important that because in our day, the viral hold of relativism, the idea that nothing is right or wrong, but thinking makes it so, to slightly misquote Shakespeare, that idea is so powerful that the Jewish tradition has to stand and say, look, there are certain things that are just wrong. And that doesn't mean that people won't do them. That doesn't even mean that people won't get away with them. But they're wrong. And that is established by the fact that the creator of the universe, who made the moral metaphysical world with God's own making, has said these things are wrong. And that's why the Ten Commandments matter. Not because they teach you something that every other society couldn't come to some extent, although I don't know about Shabbat, but they couldn't come to some extent without the Ten Commandments. They could. They absolutely could. The Code of Hammurabi, which predated the Ten Commandments, had many, many of the similar rules. And so did later codes. Difference is, the Code of Hammurabi was about Hammurabi. And the Ten Commandments is about God and about what is fundamental. And therefore, it has an authority that transcends societies. That's one. That's the first command. The second that I want to ask about and talk about is in some ways, the least explicable, understandable command. And that is that you should, and this is the last one, the 10th, you should not covet. And the reason this is so problematic is all the other commands are commands of belief or behavior. I am the Lord your God, right? You believe that, you don't. But God at the outset makes a declaration, I'm the Lord your God. That's what you should have no other gods before me. That's pretty cut and dried. But the command not to feel something, which goes so much against human nature, that's a tough one. If I say to you, don't be envious when your neighbor gets a new car and want that car, you'll say, how can I help that? How can I help but be envious? Is not, in fact, envy in some sense what our economy is built on? Someone else has this. Don't you want it? Work for it and get it. So this idea that you shouldn't want, and obviously the commentators rush in to try to explain what coveting means in this context. What does it mean, lo tachmod, that you shouldn't covet? So the conventional and in some ways least satisfactory explanation is if someone else has something, you just have to rise above it. You just have to not want it. You're just not supposed to covet it. That's, as I said, hard both to enact and even to believe that that's really the intent of the command, which says, you shouldn't covet your neighbor's wife, your neighbor's property, anything that belongs to your neighbor. So that gets us, by the way, off the marketing hook, which is you can want what your neighbor has if you don't, if what you want is not what they have, you want the same thing that they have. Like they get they get a convertible and you want a convertible, that's fine as long as your energies are directed towards getting your own convertible. But the idea that you shouldn't want theirs is taken now by the commentators in a couple different directions. The first is that it actually is a command of action, which is what Maimonides says. He says, what this really prohibits is not just wanting it, but taking any steps that bring you closer to actually getting it. That's the issue. It is a command of action. It's not about what you feel, but about what you do with what you feel. Now that makes the command explicable and puts it in accord with all the other commands about what you shouldn't do, right? Don't steal means literally don't steal. I will also point out parenthetically, and I'll get back to coveting in just a minute, but I'll point out parenthetically that it has been said, and I think with considerable justice, that all the commandments really come down to don't steal. Because in every case, you're trying to take something away that rightfully belongs to someone else, whether it's their honor, their recognition, their property, their spouse, their life, their whatever it is. Stealing is in some ways the central prohibition of the Ten Commandments. But now back to coveting. So that's the first, that's Maimonides. And also there's a rabbinic source, the Mechilta, that also says that it's about not taking steps to acquire something that isn't yours, that doesn't belong to you. But there is an attempt, as we move into the realm now of psychology, by Ibn Ezra, a really interesting attempt to interpret coveting differently, or to interpret one's reaction to coveting differently. Ibn Ezra says, look. Well, Ibn Ezra doesn't say look, but I'm saying look on behalf of Ibn Ezra, who was a medieval commentator, very famous commentator on the Torah, probably second only to Rashi in medieval times. Anyway, Ibn Ezra says, the villager, the peasant who lives in the village, does not dream of marrying the queen or the princess. He dreams of marrying the beautiful woman next door, or the beautiful woman in the town, or the beautiful woman that someone else is married to. Now he says, why is that? That's because the princess in his mind is so remote from the possibility of his marrying her that he doesn't really covet marrying the princess, right? You don't really covet marrying the person you see up on the screen, but you could seriously covet marrying somebody that you know, right? Or that you meet through whatever. Therefore, says Ibn Ezra, our minds can work in such a way that we can imagine things that are completely beyond our reach and put them out of our ambit of desire as well. Since you don't think you'll ever get a chance to marry the princess, you will not really desire and dream about marrying the princess. You'll desire and dream about marrying the woman who's married to another guy down the street. What you have to do, says Ibn Ezra, is conceive of that which belongs to someone else the way you conceive of the princess. They are, by their very nature, completely out of reach. There is no possibility that you could ever marry them. And therefore, he says, you won't covet something that you think of as out of reach. It's a pretty interesting way of interpreting the command not to covet, and I think has some merit. One last and beautiful reaction to coveting is Rabbi Michael of Zlochov, who is a Hasidic rabbi, as you might have guessed from his name. And what he says is, well, he does. Let me give you a preface that he doesn't say, but I will give you a preface that will enable you to understand what he does say better. He says, the 10 Commandments in Hebrew are not called the 10 Commandments. This may shock some of you, but they're not. They're called Aseret HaDibrot or Aseret HaDevarim, the 10 sayings, right? They're not called Aseret HaMitzvot, the 10 mitzvahs, the 10 commandments. They're called the 10 sayings. And therefore, he says, you can interpret the last one not as thou shalt not covet, but as you will not covet. What's the difference? The difference is it's not a commandment, it's a promise. If you live by these other rules that have preceded it, the previous 9 commandments, that you should believe in God, that you should not have idols, you know, the Shabbat and the false witness and honoring and loving parents and don't kill, don't steal, all of those things. If you live by that, you will discover that you don't covet what other people have, because you will have such spiritual satisfaction in your soul that you won't want what others have. So it's a promise to you. It's not a commandment. And that idea which is a beautiful idea, enables you to understand the question of coveting in a different way. Now, I know there are a couple of questions. Yes, from Clinton. The first commandment instructs us to recognize that God is real. I think that is an accurate characterization. And then the second is that no other gods are real, right? You should have no other God before me. I think those two things together are that there is one God and there should be no other. Second, any code of law would be incomplete if it didn't state rules such as do not murder that might seem obvious or assumed. Says Jim, that's true, but the question is why central? Right? There are a lot of other laws that we might think are really important that actually aren't in the Ten Commandments. So you could certainly say, well, you can't have 10 commandments without don't murder. And I could understand that. But it still, I think, has a deeper implication of not every rule is a central rule of the way the universe works, but at least from the Jewish point of view, that's something. I mean, that's important, right? Without that, without the recognition that the crimes enumerated here are crimes in some ways against God as well as against human beings. And that's part of it too. Because remember, I remember that one of my teachers made the distinction between the pagan gods and the Jewish God. He said the great distinction was that the pagan gods cared how you treated them. The Jewish God cares how you treat each other. And you could easily imagine a God that would not be so concerned about whether you steal or kill each other as long as you attend to the needs of the God. But the Ten Commandments were, it is central to me and to my world and to my universe not to murder one another, okay? And as I said before, even though I'm using the words kill and murder interchangeably, it's murder, right? It's not kill. Otherwise, you couldn't have capital punishment in the Torah, you couldn't have wars in the Torah, lots of things. No society could exist with a rule that was continually, you shall not kill, because that society would be overrun in war tomorrow, clearly. And then remember that the two paradigms of why the Ten Commandments matter are because God is both the creator of the universe and God is the God who has a deep and abiding relationship with the Jewish people. So that's why in Jewish tradition, everyone stood at Sinai. When you ask of the classical Jewish sources, why do I have to keep any of these Jewish laws? I mean, just because I was born Jewish, I didn't choose this. Their answer is, yes, you did. You may not remember, but you did, because every Jewish soul, according to the tradition, stood at Sinai, including, by the way, souls that converted stood at Sinai, even though they may not remember it. Once you are part of the Jewish tradition, you have at least metaphorically stood at Sinai, which is why in a wonderful stroke about Judith Plaskow, the Jewish feminist theologian, who was trying to reread the tradition to be more inclusive of women's experience, called her book "Standing Again at Sinai." Right. So that those two work in tandem, both the relationship of the people to God and also the relationship of God to the universe. And all of those, and both of those are what feed into making Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments. What will follow from this in the Parsha next week are a series of very specific laws to help set up a civilization. And why that is and what those are, we will talk about next week. But for the moment, I just want to also remind us that the moment of revelation was a cinematically powerful moment too. Remember, it says, Ro'im et hakolot, that you saw the voices, that there was this synesthesia, right, where sound appeared as sight and sight appeared as sound, thunder and lightning, and this gigantic pageant of this is the moment in some ways for which you were liberated, because up until now, you were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt, but now you are becoming servants to God at Sinai. And it was the sloughing off of the slavery to human beings and the servitude to something greater than ourselves. So the moment itself also, and the symbol of the mountain, and all of it contributes to what's called the Theophany, the revelation of God. And we know you can't reveal something if it hasn't been hidden, right? You only reveal things that you haven't seen. And so up until this moment, in some ways, who God was hidden from Israel. And this was their first glimpse, in a real sense, not of the God as a liberator, but the God as a lawgiver and director of their future. Up to now, they've just been running away, but now they face what will happen from now on, and why they are in the place they are, and all of that, which is an enormously powerful shift in the psyche of Israel and the direction of Israel. And now they are armed, so to speak, with the fundamental laws that will allow them to construct a society as they move forward, even in the wilderness, since these laws apply in any society, including the wilderness. And they are the building blocks of what it means to have a society, whether when they settle in Israel or earlier as they are now, while they wander. As you know, and as we will discover in a couple of weeks, not all is rosy. Moses ascends in the cloud to go up for 40 days and 40 nights. And when he comes down, things are not great among the Israelites. But we will get to the golden calf in time, or the molten calf, depending on which translation you like, in time. But for now, let us rejoice in the crystallized moment of Israel's intense experience of the revelation of God at Sinai, which we get to reenact every year at this time when we read the Parsha. And we stand for the Ten Commandments because they are the beginning of God's revelation to us and the foundation of the civilization which we and others following us have built from that. So I wish you a week of health, and hope to see you on Shabbat, when we will probably reprise some of these themes. And take care of yourself. And join me, please, tonight at I think it's at 7 o'clock for Sharon Nazarian. We will be talking tonight. I'm just checking the time. I want to make sure I get it right. We will be talking tonight about why don't I have it in my calendar? We will be talking tonight. Oh, there we go. About 6:45. 7 o'clock is, I think, the program starts. Yes. We'll be talking tonight about anti-Semitism across the world with Sharon Nazarian from the ADL, about the previous administration, the current administration, what we can expect, and I hope to see you there. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.